Osman had a dream. And in this dream, the moon came out of his chest.
Why did the Muslim world, or how did the Muslim world kind of fall and crumble into what it is today?
We often think of the Islamic world as falling behind Europe far earlier than they actually fell behind Europe.
Theory that they had to do with the fall of the Ottoman Empire later on?
There was a Jewish Messiah.
Professor Nabil Al-Tikriti, you are actually, where are you a professor? It says UMW, and I don't know.
University of Mary Washington.
Mary Washington, okay. But you received your doctorate in Ottoman history from the University of Chicago, and a bachelor's degree in Arab studies from Georgetown University, and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. You've also studied in Istanbul and Cairo, received multiple grants and scholarships, and on and on and on. You have mashallah, a very large resume.
Astaghfirullah.
And today I would love to talk to you about the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. Can you take me through that, and why is that the best place to start?
So the Ottomans themselves, they started out in a little town near Bursa in northwestern Anatolia, or northwestern Turkey today, not too far from Istanbul, across the Marmara Sea from Istanbul. And
when you mean they started off, you mean that their governance started off, they became Muslim? What do you mean by that?
Their origins are, there's always this shrouded in mystery. What it really means is the sources aren't very good. The sources that we have for the early Ottomans are very fragmentary, which is just to say they were tiny. They started out in some village. I think the village was called Saut. I might get that wrong, but I think it's Saut. And they were near Bursa in a village. I've been to that village, and there's nothing much there. It's a nice part of Turkey. There's farming there. There's hills. There's a river. It's prosperous, but there's not a lot of people there. Even in modern Turkey, there's not a lot of people there. It's rural.
I thought the Ottomans started in Central Asia.
Well, they have that foundational myth, and that's part of the later story.
Okay.
But it's much later. So the first sign that we have in real time, if you will, of Ottomans is, I believe, a Waqf document from something like the 1310s, the 13 teens. And that may be the first proof that they even existed. The first solid proof, or the first proof in stone, is after they conquered Bursa in 1324. By 1326, they put an inscription on a new mosque. And that inscription on a new mosque basically said, this mosque was paid for by Orhan Ghazi, son of Osman Ghazi. And that's the first proof we have physically that the Ottomans even existed. Now, about them coming from Central Asia, that story doesn't really get going until the Ottomans really get into writing their own history in the 1480s. But mind you, there's a lot of time between the 13 teens and the 1480s. I mean, that's 170 odd years. So that's when they articulated the story, the founding myth of the Ottomans. And the founding myth is probably a good thing to talk about next. So here's the founding myth. And you'll see in modern Turkey and in modern Ottoman history, they'll always say they started in 1299 and they ended in 1923. That 1299, they really just picked out of a hat. Like, nobody really knows 1299. But generally speaking, there's chaos, and there's a guy named Osman. Osman is just the Turkish pronunciation of Othman. So it's just like the third caliph, Othman, but he's Osman. Now, there's a minority view that says that whole story was also created later. But you have the stone in 1326 calling him Ghazi Othman, so he's probably real. His father, now, so this is the foundational myth. The foundational myth is that Osman's father was Ertuğrul, and Ertuğrul was like a tribal chief. And Ertuğrul's father was Süleyman Shah. and all of these guys came from Central Asia originally, and that they were members of the Oghuz tribal confederation. This tribal confederation is real. There was such a thing as the Oghuz, and they moved from Central Asia to Anatolia in the 11th century. The more famous cousin of the Ottomans, if you will, of the Oghuz, we're talking tens of thousands of nomads, by the way. We're not talking a few people, were the Seljuks. The Seljuks were also part of that mass movement. But the thing is, there's no real proof that the Ottomans were part of the Oghuz. It's something that they started saying in the 1480s. They're saying we're the Kaya branch of the Oghuz tribal confederation. And then they would argue that the Kaya branch was the aristocracy of the Oghuz. But they made all that up in the 1480s. So in modern scholarship, when scholars look at it very, very carefully with the sources that they have, they don't have much to go on. They got that waqf and they got that inscription, and that's about it. Mm-hmm. So did Osman exist? Probably. But did Ertugrul exist? Probably, because of oral history. But this Suleiman Shah, nobody heard of him until the 1480s. And in the 19th century, they discovered his tomb, and they discovered it in northern Syria. And this is the hilarious footnote. I find this great. When they created modern Syria and modern Turkey in 1920, the French dominated Syria. So there is a treaty whereby they granted modern Turkey sovereignty, like legal sovereignty, over the Suleiman Shah tomb in northern Syria. So there's a piece of northern Syria that's actually legally Turkey. Why? Because of Suleiman Shah's tomb. Now, where was it? It was right on the Euphrates River. So when Hafiz al-Assad built a lake, he dammed it up and built a lake, which I think is Lake Assad. They flooded the tomb. And Turkey was pretty upset because you're flooding our sovereign territory. So what they did was they moved the tomb from what is now underwater, and they kind of moved the tomb uphill on the shoreline, and that's legal Turkish territory. Mind you, we're only talking about an acre. It's like maybe the size of 3 houses or something. And in 2013, when Syria was in the middle of a civil war, Turkey used the protection of that tomb as a legal reason to invade Syria briefly and post soldiers there. And it's not far from the border. It's like 10 miles over the border. So that's like a modern part of the old story. So back to the foundational myth. There is this myth, which is a lot like the founding of Rome. I don't know if you've ever heard of Romulus and Remus, like the wolves who founded Rome. There's a very similar story as to the Ottomans, in that they had a dream, or Osman had a dream, and it's called Usmans Dream in at least one book I'm familiar with. It's the title of the book, Usman's Dream. He spent the night at a village holy man's house, and in the course of spending the night at his house, he had a dream, and in this dream, the moon came out of his chest. And the moon was a crescent moon, by the way. And out of that, or the moon came into his chest, and out of his chest grew a massive tree, which shielded the entire world. And under this tree was sort of the land of milk and honey. There was streams running down, prosperity, everything was perfect. So in the morning, he told the holy man, he goes, so I had this dream. What do you make of it? And the holy man, Sheikh Edebali, if I'm remembering the name correctly, Sheikh Edebali said to him, that means that your descendants will rule the entire world in safety and prosperity and security. And because of that dream, I would like to offer you my daughter. So that's symbolic. It's symbolic of the marrying of Din Devlet, Din, the religion from the village holy man, and devlet, or the state, meaning Osman. And that's the first Ottoman, if you will, royal mother. And that's the first Ottoman ruler, Osman, who probably existed. We don't have good sources in real time. We just have this myth from the 1480s.
This is an incredible story. So you're saying it may or may not be true, because it sounds these are called ru'yas, at least in the Islamic tradition, visions that God bestows upon the believers. And if he truly was from his descendants, the Turkish Empire, then this dream turned out to be true, right?
You could certainly take that argument, and I think the idea that this fits into the ru'ya idea fits. It fits perfectly, but I'm a little skeptical. If 170 years later somebody claims there's a dream, to me it's all great literature, is what I would say. But yes, it does fit into the idea of visions. It absolutely does. And if you're a loyal Ottoman subject and you want to believe this, then by all means. A lot of people did believe it. And loyal Ottomans would have said this was our legitimacy and our right. So, and you get the symbol, by the way, even today with the star and crescent of modern Turkey, which in a sense is an echo of that dream in the modern. Or at least I think so. I'm not sure that everyone would agree, but that's what I've come to think.
Some professors say it's from the Roman Constantinople.
Having the star and the crescent?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure I see the connection. I'm not sure I see what the connection to Byzantium would be of the star and the crescent. I do know that they had flags using the star and the crescent as early as the 16th century.
Okay.
I've seen that. I mean, I've seen it in museums.
So was he the first ruler? Was Osman the first ruler? Or you also have here the Ghazi Thesis?
All right, the Ghazi Thesis and first ruler. He's the first one that everyone claims was the ruler, and they always put 1299 as his first year. In actual fact, he never controlled more than maybe one castle and a couple of villages. He was another microstate, a city-state. So, yeah, first ruler, but ruler of a couple of castles, maybe, in this region around Sout and near Borsa. It's his son, Orhan, that conquers or captures Borsa. And Borsa was a sizable city. In today's Turkey, it's probably the 7th or 8th largest city. It's not huge, but there's a couple of million people there today. So it was a city that mattered. And that first city really put them on the map, so to speak. So that's Orhan the First. He ruled from 1324 to what I think it was 1356. And he's really the first ruler in actual fact, because he's the first one who ruled a whole city. But Osman is the one that gets the credit because they named the dynasty after him. Osman, Othman, Ottoman, things get mispronounced perhaps, but they named the dynasty after him, and they claim that he's the founder. But in looking at it neutrally, I would say Orhan's the real founder. And if he died in 1362, he also was the one who crossed the Dardanelles. And if you had the map up there a minute ago, the Dardanelles is where Gallipoli is, which was famous in World War I as well. And he, in the 1350s, I'll leave it without the exact year, in the 1350s, Orhan agreed to help one of the Byzantine princes against his brother to help this Byzantine prince get to the throne. And in doing so, in that helping him in the succession struggle, they crossed the Dardanelles into Gallipoli. And that, in effect, was the beginnings of the Ottomans in Europe. Now, mind you, this whole construct of Europe is artificial. Why is that Europe? Well, because we say it's Europe. I mean, it's a bit silly, but that's when the historians will say the Ottomans crossed into Europe. It's like 1356 or something.
Gallipoli is modern day what?
Turkey. It's
okay.
Turkey. Yeah.
Okay.
So they're still in Turkey, but they're crossing into the European part of Turkey. If you're looking at that map, you can see Çanakkale and Çanakkale is where the Dardanelles are. So that's straits. Once they cross those straits, they're in what geographers consider Europe, which again is an artificial construct.
Right.
All right, so a little bit north of that, you see Adrianople? They conquered Adrianople in 1363. Adrianople is modern Edirne. They Turkified the name. Originally named after Hadrian, the Roman emperor. But today, it's called Edirne. They Turkified the name. And they conquered that in 1363, and that was their second capital. The first capital was Bursa. The second one was Edirne. Now, Orhan I, the one that I was telling you about, there's not much more to say about him except that he conquered Bursa, he crossed the Dardanelles, he died in, I think you said 1362, and his son was Murad I. He's the next one. And so far, they've died of natural causes, and nobody's killed any brothers. That comes a bit later. It's all peaceful. It's still on the Mongol model of corporate rule, a Panaj system. In other words, the family rules together. Mm-hmm.
And Osman and Orhan, how did they even galvanize troops to conquer anything? Were people galvanizing around this idea of dreams? Were they a tribe at this point? Were that 4 castles playing a role?
All right, that's the Ghazi Thesis. That's where that comes in. So the Ghazi Thesis was first articulated by an Austrian historian named Paul Wittek, who's himself fascinating because Paul Wittek, although I don't believe he was Jewish, fled the Nazis in the 1930s and found refuge in London. And he's one of the great early Ottoman historians of the 20th century. So Paul Wittek came up with what is widely known as the Ghazi Thesis. His thesis was that it's a little bit like Asabiya from Ibn Khaldun. The Ottomans had collective enthusiasm. They had a new zeal. They had new collective enthusiasm. They had Asabiya. What was the Asabiya? Ghazi, holy war, if you will. Now, Wittek was not simply saying that they were pious Muslims who are out to expand Islam. That's a simplistic take on it. He has a much more complex take on it, I would argue. And the thesis is held up pretty well. It's partially based on the American frontier thesis of, and there's another name that's escaping me, but a famous history of American history, Turner, I think was his name, the Turner thesis of the American frontier. And the idea there is that because they were on the frontier with the Byzantines, they attracted a lot of support from Ghazis who wanted to fight for the faith. Now, cynically, they weren't just fighting for the faith, they were also fighting for plunder. Because there's this whole old idea that if you conquer from the enemy, then you can keep all of the plunder except the khums, the 20% that the imam keeps. This is, a medieval idea. Did you get the name of the historian? It's Turner, I think, the Turner thesis. There we go. The frontier thesis. Yep. So that is what Paul Wittek adjusted. It was an American history idea about the frontier and the Native Americans and how that is how, America conquered the West. He took that thesis but applied it to the Ottomans. And he said, well, all of these Ghazis came from all over the Islamic world to fight the Greeks. And the Greeks, by the way, had their own version. They're called Akratai. And what's kind of interesting about it sociologically is the Akratai and the Ghazis were very similar to each other. They knew each other's language, so the Greeks knew Turkish, the Turks knew Greek. They were all intermarried. They were both fighting for the faith, but they're on a frontier, and they're more like each other than either one of them is like their own cosmopolitan capital. So the cosmopolitan capital at the time is either Konya or Baghdad or Cairo, where, the Muslim capitals on the Muslim side, and on the Greek side, it's Constantinople, which isn't even that far away, really. And the Wittek thesis, the Ghazi thesis, is that that's why the Ottomans, in effect, grew. They grew because they could attract enthusiastic followings of Muslims who wanted to fight to expand Darul Islam. Now, I don't totally agree with the sort of ideological portion, but part of that theory does make sense, and that is what I like to call location, location, location. If you look at this map of Western Anatolia, imagine that just that part of Western Anatolia is about 7 or 8 mini-states. And the Silk Road, going all the way from China to Constantinople, starts at Constantinople, and that is one of the main trade routes, especially in the post-Mongol era. So there's a lot of commerce going from Constantinople all the way out to China on the northern Silk Road. Well, who's closest to the beginnings of the Silk Road on the western end? The Ottomans. It's location, location, location. They're right there. And they had a competitor to their west called the Karası, and they had another competitor to their northeast, the Germianids, and those guys just didn't have as good a location. They weren't right there at the beginning of the Silk Road. So that's the Ghazi Thesis plus my little take on it, location, location, location. They had the best location.
And civilizations usually start off with what I call a spark of civilization. It's just something that occurs, as you were saying, within the masses. This overall, what'd you say, this overall
Asabiya, which is an Arabic term,
like drive.
Yeah, drive or zeal. It's usually in translated as zeal. Now, I'll point out that Asabiya in its original Arabic actually meant something like sectarianism. But then when Ibn Khaldun took that term and turned it into a historical thesis, it came to mean more zeal, enthusiasm, collective identity.
And you can even see it today. You can see a huge difference between the zeal or the mentality of the Western civilization as opposed to other civilizations that you may determine isn't a powerhouse today. It just you can visually see it, and I don't necessarily think it has anything to do with ideology, as you were saying. It's just a spark.
Well, to go back to Ibn Khaldun's thesis, now a little bit more about Ibn Khaldun, who's quite famous. A lot of scholars call him the first sociologist, which is maybe a bit overstating it. But Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, which is just the introduction to his world history, he puts out his historical theory, and his historical theory is built around the idea of Asabiya. Ibn Khaldun came from North Africa, I think what is today Algeria. And in the centuries prior to Ibn Khaldun, who died in 1406, there was the Al-Murabitun, or the Almoravids, and the Al-Muwahidun, the Almohads. And these guys were where he got the idea. The idea is any dynasty rises and then falls based on their ability to maintain asabiya. And it's a very logical argument. In effect, he's saying that you start the story with there is a state in a capital. It's in a city. And out of the countryside arises a new power because they have new asabiya. And then they destroy the old dynasty, they capture the capital, they replace the old dynasty, they create a new dynasty. That's generation 1. Generation 2 continues and expands the dynasty. Generation 3 starts to lose it. It's similar to theories about wealth. The first, the founder of a wealthy family, in effect, is the founder of the wealthy family. His son grows the wealth and expands the family power, and then the grandson kind of spends it all, and that's the end of that family. It doesn't necessarily last only 3 generations, but that's the idea. This is a very similar idea. Now, taking it back to the Ottomans, they had, according to Ibn Khaldun, he would have said they had the Asabiya to capture Bursa, and then later Edirne, and then even later than that, Constantinople itself, today's Istanbul. But that's much later.
And you're defining Asabiya as zeal.
Yeah, that's the way I'm interpreting it.
Can you search up what zeal means just so I could get it right? Okay. Because that's interesting.
Enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm.
Yeah, enthusiasm.
Okay. Would drive work as well?
Drive can work, sure.
Drive? Okay, interesting. And so, would you like to talk about Bayezid the First, or you also you also have pointed here 1453.
All right, well, let's advance the story a little further. So 1363 is what I believe it said Murad I came to power. Now, Murad I continued to expand the Ottoman territory into the Balkans. And they slowly took, like, what is today Thessaloniki or Salonika. They took what is today northern Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria, or parts of Bulgaria into Kosovo. And that's all fine and dandy until the 1389 Battle of Kosovo. And that was where Murad I defeated the Serbian Knights. And the Serbian Knights were blown away by the Ottomans. And that's the famous Battle of Kosovo. But after the Battle of Kosovo, a Serbian prisoner jumped Murad I with a knife and killed him right there after the battle. So they built a little shrine for him, and that shrine is still there in Kosovo. And other parts of his body were moved to Bursa, where he was buried at the first capital of the Ottomans. Immediately after that battle, Beyezid I, whose nickname is Yildirim, which means thunderbolt, took over. And Beyezid I was very aggressive. And I guess Murad was as well, but not as aggressive. Murad I was out to expand the Ottoman territory at the expense of Christians, the Christian rulers of the Balkans. Bayezid changed things up a bit. He started to gobble up these other Muslim beyliks in a hostile way. Like he'd advance on them and give them an ultimatum, and in some cases he actually just invaded them in Anatolia. So he started knocking off other Muslim beyliks, and he would still advance into what was then the Christian Balkans. So that was going great for the Ottomans. They were expanding still into further into Anatolia to the east and south, and further into the Balkans to the north and west. Until Timur turned up. Now, I mentioned Timur earlier as the guy who wanted to rebuild the Mongol Empire. That's in a way his, Chingizid restoration is what they call it in the scholarship. He wanted to restore Mongol supremacy. So Timur turned up in 1401, right as Bayezid was about to siege Constantinople. So Bayezid in 1401 built a castle on the Anatolian side of the Bosphorus. You still see that castle under the first bridge of Istanbul. And it's not a very large castle, but that was his castle to siege Constantinople. Well, right around that time, Timur shows up and they start exchanging correspondence. And the correspondence is a bit like a rap. I think of it as like a rap daring contest, like yo mama, no yo mama, no yo mama. It's very ornate Persian, letters, but they're basically yo mama in ornate Persian. So Timur brings this massive Central Asian army, tens of thousands of nomadic warriors, and they fight at what is called the Battle of Ankara in 1402. And in this battle, in the lead up to that battle, Timur told all of the beylik survivors that he would restore their sovereignty if they would abandon Bayezid, because they were all Bayezid's Sipahi cavalry. Now, the Sipahis were the aristocracy. They were free-born cavalry who did several things at the same time. They collected taxes for their Timars, and they would provide horsemen and retainers, which was calibrated according to how much taxes they collected. And they lived off the taxes, too. It's called tax farming. Well, those Sipahis were mostly former beyliks that the Ottomans co-opted. They made them an offer they couldn't refuse. They said, join us or we're going to invade. So they usually joined the Ottomans, but they weren't all that happy about it, because instead of ruling their own mini-state, they're part of a larger state and they're aristocracy, but they're no longer calling the shots. So what Timur said is, all right, I will restore your independence if you abandon Bayezid on the battlefield. So the two armies meet, and the Sipahis just took off and left Bayezid high and dry with only his infantry. Now, the infantry was the famous Janessaries. And the Janessaries, so another digression. When were the Janessaries founded? They were apparently founded by Murad in like the 1380s, possibly earlier. It might have been earlier, but I think it's the 1380s. They definitely existed by the 1390s. There's no doubt about it. And the Janissaries were Christian children who were taken by what is called the Devshirme. Devshirme is a Turkish word that means the gathering together. And the way to think of it is a medieval or an early modern draft. And what they would do is they would take 20% of the boys in a village. And the justification for the 20% is still that khums, the royal fifth. The idea that the imam can keep 20% of plunder after conquest. And there's a lot of fascinating decisions that went into that. One, they didn't take Greeks, by and large, because the Greeks were already Christian when Muhammad delivered the message, whereas the Serbs were not yet Christian, and the Bulgarians were not yet Christian. So the legal argument that the Ottomans made is you can't take Greeks because they're protected. They're
people of the book.
Yeah, Ahl al-Kitab.
Right.
Whereas the Serbs and the Bulgarians, even though they were Christians in the 14th century, they were not Christians when Muhammad brought the message. So they're not Ahl al-Kitab according to the Ottomans, at least not for these purposes. So they would go into a village, a Serbian or a Bulgarian village, and they would take 1 in 5 boys. And they would take the best 1 in 5 boys. They would line all the boys up and they would interview them. And if the kid was dumb as a rock, they're like, thanks, you just stay here. The kid was pretty smart and could bust some heads, physically a good specimen, they'd take that kid. Those kids would then be raised in a Turkish family, mostly in Anatolia. They would be taught Turkish, they would be taught Islam, and when they graduated at roughly 18, so they were roughly 12 years old when they were taken, they graduated 18. When they graduated, they were then Muslims, and they sort of became Muslim as they became a Janissary soldier at the same time. Now, what's interesting about that Battle of Ankara is the Janissaries fought to the death. These guys were all born Christians, but they fought to the death. Whereas all the there were some Christian Sipahis, but they were mostly Muslims. They took off.
Because you and I, in our last episode, you've expressed to me that the treatment of the Janissaries was so good and that they were basically turned into elites, like almost kidnapped, and then the best circumstance one could possibly be in a kidnap situation is turned into the elite of an empire.
Right. So over the long view, over centuries, the Janissaries became what you could think of as a conversion engine, because a lot of Balkan Christians wanted to be Janissaries. Now, there's a debate, and this is a fair debate. Greek, Bulgarian, Serbian nationalist scholars say that the Ottomans stole their children. So it's an abomination. And they're not wrong. But the counter argument is, like you were just saying, is that these guys ran the state. This is where the Grand Viziers came from. This is where all the pashas came from. So all the generals and ministers, they were from this slave soldier class. The Kul, K-U-L, the Kul class, which, by the way, is very similar to the Mamluks in Egypt. It's the same sort of military slave class that is providing your military. So the Janissaries over centuries became the way to rise fast. And do you think of it as stealing children, or do you think of it as recruiting for the state? It's your choice, really. They're both right. So at that battle, they were loyal. Now, after that battle, Bayezid was captured. He didn't die on the battlefield. Timur captured him, put him in a cage, and showed him off at state banquets. And it was pretty horrific treatment of Bayezid physically. And he died some weeks later. I don't know how much later, but at least maybe a month or two later, he died because of all the abuse. And what Timur did is he was good to his word. After 1402, all those beyliks were restored. All those mini-states were restored. And the Ottomans were broken up into 4 sub-dynasties. There were 4 brothers fighting each other. So one brother would be here, one brother here, sort of 4 different places. And then Timur left. And then Timur died not that long after. 1405, I think it was, Timur died. So that's then the interregnum, the period of Ottoman chaos. Of those 4 brothers, and one of them is probably a false brother, like no one's really sure. He's like, yeah, I'm the other brother, and everybody's like, no, you're not. And then he's like, yes, I am. So there's this bizarre case of a false claimant to the throne. There's 3 other proper brothers. Anyway, there's basically 11 years of civil war, and from these 11 years, Mehmet was the one who won, and that's Mehmet I, or Mehmet Çelebi. And Mehmet is just Turkish pronunciation of Muhammad. And that's Mehmet I. And Mehmet I consolidated power in 1413 and then died in, I think, 1420 or 1421 maybe. And his claim to fame is that he consolidated the empire and prepared it to re-expand over all those beyliks that had been restored, and then expand again into the Balkans. He didn't expand, but he reunified what Timur had broken up. And then his son was Murad II. And Murad II ruled from 1421 to 1453. His credit and his claim to fame, if you will, Murad II, after his father Mehmed consolidated the state, Murad II started expanding again. So he expanded into the Balkans primarily, not so much into Anatolia, but he expanded into the Balkans. And his most important battle was the Battle of Varna in 1444 on the Black Sea coast. And at this battle, he defeated a Crusader army. Murad II retired right after the Battle of Varna. So that's where I would take the thread up now.
Is that unprecedented?
That's unusual. And in fact, I'm not aware of it really happening again or before. So
either Ottoman or not Ottoman, has it happened?
It's unusual for a ruling monarch to retire. I mean, You can, I suppose. It just happened a couple of months ago that I think it was the Danish king retired, and everybody was like, oh my God, we love that queen, I think it was. So you can retire, but it's just unusual.
Okay.
So he retired, and he elevated his son Mehmed II to the throne. Now, Mehmed II, who went on to be known as Mehmed the Conqueror.
Oh, this is him.
This is Mehmed the Conqueror.
They're just recycling names, are they? First Murad.
Well, it's not that unusual in any society. It's often the case in Islamic society that you take your grandfather's name. That's not unusual at all.
I have my grandfather's name. Actually.
Right. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're all calling him after their grandfather, which, you can sort of imagine that. It's like, yeah, well, Grandpappy passed away. Let's pass the name on, that kind of thing. Now, Mehmed II was only 12 years old at the time, which makes him, in effect, pubescent and right about ready to take on adulthood, but he's just barely, he's 12 years old. So when he took power, all the ministers were really in charge. Mehmet was not in charge. The ministers were in charge. Most famously, this family of grand viziers called the Chandarlas. And so it was the Grand Vizier Chandarla who was really calling the shots. And within a year or two, there was an emergency. probably a military emergency. I don't remember the details, but some European power basically turned up on the frontier because there's a 12-year-old in charge. So Murad II came out of retirement and told Mehmed, sorry, son, you're no longer the Sultan. I'm back in charge. That's also unprecedented. First retiring, but then coming out of retirement. And he ruled until he died in 1453. So he ruled until 1444. He stepped down for a brief period. There was this experiment with his son Mehmed II. Mehmed II didn't pan out as a 12-year-old, so he came back.
And wasn't Mehmed pretty embarrassed by this?
Exactly. So when the old man died in 1452, Murad II died, and Mehmed II came to power. And the first thing he did was kill his infant brother. And this is not the first time that an Ottoman ruler killed his brother, but it's the beginning of the custom of fratricide, which is that you have to kill your brother if you want to be, or once you take the throne, you must kill your brother. And in effect, this is the Ottoman response to the chaos after 1402. And it's also the Ottoman response to the Mongol legacy of everybody of equal blood being equally legitimately on the throne. So he killed his 2-year-old toddler brother. Jeez. And then passed a law or announced a law that you must do this. And the reason you have to do it in Turkish, and it's actually mostly Arabic, Nizam-i Alem için, or, Alishan Nizam al-Alam. You have to do it to preserve the stability of the world. That was the phrase. And from that point on, until the mid-17th century, every time there was a new Ottoman ruler, they would kill all their brothers. So this became a thing in the Ottoman palace. But he's the first one that announced it as a policy. There had been others before him, but he's the first one to do it as a policy. So the next thing he did is he said, and by this point he's about 18 years old. He's not 12 anymore. He's like 18, and he's angry. He's angry at the ministers, especially the Chandarlas. But he doesn't do anything at first against the Chandarlas. Instead, he announces, I'm going to take Constantinople. And who's with me? Now, there's a lot of enthusiasm. So they're going to take Constantinople, which by that time is just a little city-state. All that the Byzantines controlled by 1453 was Constantinople itself, almost nothing else. So he announced that he's going to take it. The Byzantines were quite upset. They sent letters all over Europe like, come help us, come help us, come help us. There were some Italians who did help them, several thousand, like 4,000 or 5,000 Italians did come to help. But there were other Italians that lived right across the Golden Horn from Constantinople who stayed out of it. They signed an agreement with Mehmet and said, we're not fighting. So then you get the Great Battle of Constantinople, which is itself a whole episode if you want it to be.
So he did this when he was 18?
18 years old, he announced it. And the way he fought that battle is actually very impressive. It's a very impressive story and one that could go on quite a while. So first thing he did was he built another castle on the Bosphorus, what is called Rumeli Hisarı, right across from the castle that, what would it be, his great-grandfather Beyezid had built on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. So Rumeli Hisarı was on the European side of the Bosphorus. If you go to modern Istanbul and you go on the first bridge, these two castles are pretty much right next to the first bridge over the Bosphorus in modern Istanbul. And to build that castle, he set off a competition. He said, whoever builds their tower first gets a bonus. So he had 3 generals. One took this tower, one took this tower, one took that tower. It was basically a triangular castle. And he built it in 90 days. And if you look at that thing today, you're like, whoa, how did they build that in 90 days? Because it's massive stones. And it's very impressive as a structure. But they built it in 90 days, or at least they built one of the towers in 90 days. So the next thing he did was he said, nobody can travel on the Bosphorus without permission. And of course, some Italian sailors did dare them by trying to go from the Black Sea down the Bosphorus to Constantinople to help the Byzantines. Well, they sunk that ship, and as the sailors were swimming to shore, they captured them and then beheaded them and put their heads on pikes. So nobody else tried to help the Byzantines after that, because that's a pretty strong message. So then you get the battle itself. Along the land walls, which you can still see in modern Istanbul, on the land walls there was something like 100,000 Ottoman troops, and the Byzantines only had maybe 15,000 to oppose the 100,000. And the Ottomans had like the biggest cannon that had ever been seen, that a Hungarian specialist had built for them. But they were unable to breach that wall. They kept trying to force the wall, and the Byzantines kept turning them back. So what then happened? There was a chain over what is called the Golden Horn, which is this inlet that surrounds or that separates old Constantinople from Galata on the other side of the Golden Horn. The Byzantines had put a chain over the entrance to the Golden Horn so that the Ottomans could not sail soldiers up on that side. So what the Ottomans did, and it's a bit hard to describe, they took ships and they rolled them on logs uphill on the other side of Galata, and then they rolled them downhill into the Golden Horn behind the chain. And like they did this with several ships.
How long did it take them to do this?
I don't know.
Because they had to chop down forest trees to do this.
To roll the ship up the hill and then roll the ship down the hill. Yeah. And the Italians are kind of looking at this from Galata going, whoa, good thing we signed a deal, I guess. And the Byzantines are like, oh man, there goes another wall we have to defend. And that's where the breach happened, because there were walls there, but there was only this 15,000 soldiers. Once they moved them over there, they were too thin to hold off that attack. So then the Ottomans poured through, and there was 3 days of looting. And it was pretty terrible, actually. But after 3 days, Mehmet said, that's it. That's enough violence. That's enough plunder. We're stopping now. This is now my capital. I will rebuild this city. And that's what he went on to do. Now, a little bit about Mehmed the Conqueror. He's not just some military figure. He was educated in Greek, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and possibly even some Latin or Italian. The guy was a Renaissance man as a ruler. And he's also very secular. He's not really very pious. He wasn't interested in religious policy. He was rather a Renaissance man, as I guess what you would call him. And he was very scientific, very powerful. And the other thing is, the first thing after taking over Constantinople that he did was execute Chandarla Halil, the Grand Vizier that had told him, or that had dominated him when he was 12 years old. The excuse being, he accused him of treason because Chandarla did not want them to attack Constantinople at all. In effect, the Chandarla family was quite close to the Byzantines. They had a good arrangement. So once he took Constantinople, he executed Chandarla for treason.
He had like economic benefits there, right? Like profit.
Chandarla did, yeah. So the city in 1453, the city was in ruins. There might have been 10 or 15,000 people total surviving the siege. The numbers are very small. But within 50 years, it was the largest city on earth at the time, with over 1 million people. So the first thing, or the second thing after executing Chandarla, was Mehmet instituted a building program. And he built all kinds of structures in Istanbul that you still see today. So that includes expanding the covered market, which is very famous. There was a Byzantine market there. If you go to the covered market today, have you guys been to Istanbul, by the way? No. Well, I recommend it. It's a great city. Yeah, but anyway, so you went. So if you see the covered market, there's a corner of it that's what's left of the old Byzantine covered market. And he expanded it by probably 10 times. It's like a little corner of it today is the old Byzantine market, but it's 10 times the size of that. He also built the Old Palace, is what they called it, and the Old Palace was made of wood, and it was in the center of the city. Today, it's the site of Istanbul University. And because it was made of wood, in the 18th century, it burnt down in a fire. But he wasn't that happy with that first old palace, so he built what he called the New Palace. The New Palace is what we today call Topkapı Palace, which is on the edge of the peninsula of Constantinople or Istanbul. And that's Topkapı Palace, and that palace is the palace that the Ottomans are famous for. It's right behind Hagia Sophia, which was the big church at the time. And that church then became converted to a mosque, and that Hagia Sophia is today still like a big tourist site in downtown Istanbul. And then he moved into the new palace. So he expanded the market, he built the old palace, then he built the new palace. He built some other, he built Ayub Sultan shrine. So this Ayub Sultan is another one of those myths. In a dream, so you talk about the ru'ya, the vision, Mehmed had a vision. And his vision was Ayub died over there, right outside the city walls. So who's Ayub, you might ask? Well, he's one of the Prophet's companions, Prophet Muhammad's companions. And the story of Ayub was he was at the first Muslim siege of Constantinople, which would have been in the 8th century, like in, 715 or something like that. So way back in the 8th century, there was a Muslim siege of Constantinople by sea, and Ayub died there. And he was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, mind you, that the math doesn't quite work, because Muhammad died in 632, and this siege is in like 715. If you do the math, that's like 85 years between them. But you can see a scenario where this Ayub might have been like a 2-year-old when Muhammad died and was an 87-year-old at that siege. In any case, they had no idea where he was buried. Muhammad or Mehmed the Conqueror just had a vision and said he's buried over there. So they built a shrine there, and that is the shrine of Ayub Sultan. And what that shrine became is, if you will, the most holy space in Constantinople. It became the religious center, if you will, of Constantinople. It's right outside the original city walls. And that's where new Ottoman sultans would start their inaugural parade. They would start by presenting their, if you will, respect to Ayub, or in Arabic, Ayub, Ayub Sultan in Turkish, and then they would ride a horseback all the way to Topkapı Palace, where they would then be enthroned and crowned. So that started that started as a tradition right there.
You mentioned that Mehmed the Conqueror wasn't very religious, yet wasn't his siege of Constantinople based off the prophecy by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him?
That was certainly a part of it, because there is this hadith that I'm blanking on the details of the hadith, but there's some hadith about Constantinople.
Where it's like, Muhammad, can you actually tell us it? I think it's noble is the
one who takes Constantinople or captures Constantinople.
And he believed himself to be that person.
Sure, but I don't know that he's necessarily very religious, but he definitely did plug into that hadith.
Well, what made you say that he isn't?
Well, that's his reputation. His reputation is that he's more of a secular leader, that he was interested in Greek philosophy. He was interested in...
well, I'm very interested in Greek philosophy.
And you're also, you can also say that you're religious. So perhaps he was religious, but by reputation he wasn't. By reputation he's not at all. Time? Yeah, they don't talk about him as a religious figure. The sources just don't. They talk about him as like a Renaissance figure. Like he had a famous portrait of himself done by Bellini, and that's not something that a religious ruler would necessarily do, because of the figural, the lack of figural representation, or the idea that you don't do figural representation. But he had Bellini. He commissioned Bellini, a famous Italian Renaissance portrait artist, to do his portrait, which still exists. It's somewhere in a museum.
Yeah. I think sometimes the best people are the ones that are both, right? Like religious, but also have that, you know.
Well, he's definitely talented.
Yeah.
And he's definitely using religious imagery in his politics. And he might have been religious. I didn't meet the fella, but you know, he might have been. But in terms of state policy, he didn't push religion, or he didn't push a religious agenda as much as his son did, or his grandson or great grandson, really. Like Bayezid and Suleiman, his son, and then his great grandson, they had a religious agenda much more than Mehmet did.
And you noted here the date of 1453. Why is that important? Or was that the Siege of Constantinople?
That's the Siege of Constantinople. Now, to expand a little bit on the importance of 1453, it is a huge date in world history. It's not just an Ottoman date. It's conventionally considered in most Western civilization textbooks to mark the end of the medieval and the beginning of the Renaissance, which is artificial. It's just a construct of historians. But that's often what they'll say, is that it ended the medieval, it started the Renaissance. It also, and in this case it ended the Roman Empire. So famously, there's this famous book by Edward Gibbon, written in 1776 is when it was completed, called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Gibbons, who wrote that book, had a whole thesis about how Christianity destroyed the Roman Empire. He was very anti-Christian. Gibbons was. By the way, that book, it was such a bestseller. You can still buy it at Barnes & Nobles.
I literally just wrote it down. Should I read it?
Sure. It's a great read. I mean, it was written in 1776, so the English is a little bit archaic sometimes. But he had a sense of humor. And it's a great read, and you can still buy it. It's still out there. Like, I've seen it on the shelf at Barnes & Nobles, which blew me away. So anyway, he marks the end of that story with 1453. And all right, other things about 1453. Well, it's the beginning of the story of it going from being Constantinople to Istanbul. It's part of the story of the Islamicization of what is today Turkey, but it's only one part, because Turkey was probably as much as 30% Christian, Armenian, or Greek until after World War I. So it's part of a long process of Turkification, which is really 1,000 years process, but it's a landmark in that.
I had another historian on, Mustafa Briggs, that said that Mehmed the Conqueror viewed himself as the continuation of the Roman Empire. He called himself, Kaysar-i-Rum, right?
That's absolutely accurate. And the Ottomans, not just Mehmed himself, but continuing after Mehmed, the Ottomans saw themselves as the continuation of Rome. It's in their architecture. It's in their titles. He definitely called himself Kaiser, but he also called himself Khusro, Padishah. Padishah-i Alim Pena was a title that Suleiman started to use. So the shadow of God, Zillallah. Not yet, but later on they might take the caliphate itself, like after Suleiman. So there's a lot of titles floating around, but Kaiser's one of the titles. And in the architecture, that sort of distinctive Ottoman mosque style, which has a huge dome and sort of thin minarets.
Yeah,
that is an echo of Hagia Sophia, and Hagia Sophia was the main Byzantine church, which they then converted into a mosque, and then they imitated it. It's almost like a modern brand or a modern logo, and in fact they do use it as a modern logo, like the symbol of the city of Istanbul on letterhead and on caps and all kinds of things is logoed as basically the Blue Mosque, and the Blue Mosque is the one with 6 minarets. It's also called the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, and it's the classic Ottoman style of mosque. Well, that whole Ottoman style of mosque is an echo of Hagia Sophia, and it's completely different than what the Mamluks left behind in Egypt, for example. It's a completely different mosque style.
And where does Salim the Grim fit into this narrative?
All right, so Salim the Grim, we're 2 rulers away from him. So let's do Bayezid next. or let's finish up Fatih Mehmet. So we call him Fatih Mehmet, Mehmed the Conqueror. After he conquered Constantinople, that's just the beginning of his conquest. He had several more to come. So I can't always remember the dates, but he took out, or he defeated in the 1470s Uzun Hasan of the Akkoyunlu. I think that was 1473. He didn't wipe him out. He just defeated him and then pushed him back. Uzun Hasan had to retreat. Uzun Hasan, by the way, Uzun means tall. He was Tall Hasan. And he was the ruler of the Akkoyunlu, which was the rival dynasty that by the 1450s and 1460s controlled Iran in the Caucasus. So they're neighbors to the east. In the 1460s, he also took out Trabzon, which was a Greek monarchy in Trabzon on the Black Sea. That was in like 1463, maybe. He chased down Skanderbeg, who's kind of the George Washington of Albania. Like, he's the hero of Albania. And Skanderbeg had sort of a 15-year guerrilla war in the mountains of Albania against Mehmed the Conqueror, but he eventually lost. He took out the Karamanids, which was the most important rival Beylik to the south. And he took them out in, I think, the 1460s. So it's just one conquest after another, mostly in Anatolia, actually, but not only in Anatolia. He had also battles to the north into the Balkans. So that's all Mehmed the Conqueror. When he died...
So he focused primarily on Europe?
No, well, he did
Where's
both.
Anatolia?
He's really consolidating Anatolia mostly.
Okay.
But he also did some things in what is today Greece and into the Balkans. So other places that he conquered, let's see if I can remember. It's not coming to me right off the bat. Albania, yeah, that's Europe. That's the Balkans. He also took some Rhodes. He tried to take the island of Rhodes in the Aegean to conquer the Knights of Rhodes, who were a Christian military order. The Knights of Rhodes, also known as the Knights of St. John. And that was in 1480, but he failed. He didn't manage to defeat them. They only were conquered by Suleiman the Magnificent in 1522. So they held out another 40 years. And the last thing that Mehmed did before he died in 1481 was he set up an invasion of Italy. He wanted to get the other Rome, namely Rome and Italy. So he landed on the very heel of the Italian peninsula. So you know how Italy looks like a boot?
Yeah.
And there's a toe and there's a heel. The very tip of that heel is Otranto. And they conquered Otranto. But it's just that one town. And they occupied it from 1480. And then when Mehmed died in 1481, they withdrew. So the Ottomans briefly occupied a chunk of Italy, but only this one town in the heel of Italy. All right, so 1481, Mehmed the Conqueror died. He died of gout, which I always find amazing. How does one die of gout?
What's gout?
Gout used to be known as the king's disease. And I've actually had it myself. It's what you have if you eat too much meat and drink too much. So that's why it's called the king's disease, because who can afford to drink and eat that much meat? Only the king. And what it does is it creates like crystals in your feet, makes it very painful to walk. And for it to kill you, he must have had some terrible example of it. But he died of that.
Oh, so alcohol, like he was drinking alcohol.
Oh, yeah. And he was drinking. That's another reason that he might not have been that religious. But all of these sultans drank heavily, to be honest. And he was drinking rot gut. Like he was drinking the hard stuff.
How come Americans don't get this then?
Don't get this or don't?
Yeah,
don't get gout?
Yeah, I feel like Americans drink and eat meat a lot.
Well, I think you have to be... If I remember correctly, it's got to be a certain type of alcohol that does it to you.
Okay.
So I don't know. We'd have to look it up. Okay. So when he died, he was getting ready for another campaign to the east, and they were desperate not to tell anyone that he died, because that's when the soldiers get all ornery. They want a bonus. It's chaos. Every time the sultan dies, there's chaos. It's a vacuum of power. I mean, it's the same thing in any state. So when he died, they told the soldiers, they told the Janissaries, oh, he's just sick. Give him some time. He'll be back. But it was August, and the corpse started to smell. So they put candles to keep the corpse from stanking up the tent too much. And anyway, after about 3 days, the Janissaries realized that he was dead. So the Janissaries rebelled, and they had a riot in downtown Istanbul, and especially targeted. This is one of those rare cases where you can say that there was what you could call an anti-Jewish pogrom. Not something that happened a lot, but it did happen then. They went after the Jewish shopkeepers in downtown Istanbul, and there were riots, and they destroyed the market, and there was chaos. And then the guy that I wrote my dissertation on, as a 12-year-old himself, took power for 3 weeks. That's Shehzade Korkut.
And was he related to Mehmed?
Yeah, he was Mehmet's grandson.
Okay.
So when Mehmet died, there were 2 princes that were competing for the throne.
Wait, before we get into that, why'd they even attack specifically the Jewish merchants?
That's not something I'm aware of, and it's not a big deal not a big deal. It's not very well remembered.
Or did they just attack merchants and they happened to be Jewish?
That may be the case.
Okay.
But the sources just say merchants. The European sources clarify that they were Jewish merchants. So I don't know. I'd have to look into that a little deeper to be sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to look into that a little deeper to be sure. So in any case, there is this riot. And Korkut was put on the throne to calm them down. He paid a bonus. He calmed them down. And for 3 weeks, he was the sultan. But he was only holding the place for his father. And his father was Beyezid II. So Beyezid II was coming from Amasya, which is north of Ankara on that map. And his brother, Cem, was coming from Konya, where he had his princely capital in Konya. And they raced to get to Constantinople, because the first prince that makes it to Constantinople, in effect, is the winner. And Bayezid got there first. And Cem tried to take Constantinople, but he failed. So then there was a battle in central Anatolia, and Cem lost again. So Cem then fled to the Mamluks. He fled to Egypt. And then he did the Hajj. He was the only Ottoman royal figure to do the Hajj until the late 19th century.
Wow.
So again, you're saying how religious they are. So he's the only one that went on the Hajj. And he probably only went on the Hajj because he was in Egypt, in exile, in effect. So the Mamluks then, in effect, armed him, gave him money, and said, well, good luck, getting the throne back. So he took his forces up and lost again, because he's facing the entire Ottoman army. He then fled to the Knights of Rhodes, those knights who were in Rhodes, which is in the gateway of the Aegean Sea. And they then sent him to the papacy. So he went to Italy, and then he went to France, and then back to Italy, and he was in exile. And Cem survived in exile until 1496, when he was poisoned by an agent of Bayezid. And all those years from 1481 to 1496, he was like this celebrity prince in exile. He was the biggest thing Europe had ever seen. So there were novels and operas and all kinds of accounts of the amazing visit of Prince Cem. And it was like the biggest thing Europe had ever seen at the time.
Why is that?
Because they had never seen any Ottoman royalty. Like, Ottoman royalty didn't leave the Ottoman Empire. He's the only one who ever did up to that point. And the Ottomans at this point already control all of the Balkans, all of Anatolia, and they're a regional power. They're not as powerful as they got later, but they're a regional power.
And they had a lot of political sway and determined a lot of the narratives that were happening in Europe at that time?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Bayezid took power in 1481. And I know this period the best because the prince that I did a dissertation on was one of Bayezid's sons, Korkut. Now, Korkut, well, I don't know how much I should get into Korkut, but that could be a whole episode there because Korkut is a fascinating figure himself. But I don't know if I should say too much about him now. Let's go back to Bayezid. So Bayezid took power in 1481, and the first thing he did was knock off Cem's 4-year-old son, to knock off, rival lines. And Bayezid himself, remember that this is the harem system. So he had multiple concubines, and he, by the end of it, had 9 sons and something like 12 daughters. So Korkut's only one of 9 sons. And all of those sons, with one possible exception, were by different mothers. Different concubine mothers. There's one possible exception to that. And Bayezid was pretty much the opposite of Mehmed in many ways. Mehmed was conquer, conquer, conquer. He was always in military campaigns. And Bayezid, in effect, digested all of the territory that Mehmed had won. So he invested in building up the capital city. He reduced the taxes because to do all that conquest, Mehmed had raised taxes on everybody. So Bayezid could see that there was a lot of tension over that, a lot of rebellions that were about to start. So he reduced the taxes, he stopped the campaigns, and he invested in administration. And he became known as Veli Bayezid, or, if you will, Saint Bayezid. Veli Bayezid in Turkish. That was his nickname. So he was considered very pious, but not in his youth. He was pious as an older, which you often see amongst people. He became pious older and later in life. And Bayezid pushed what you could call a religious agenda of state policy. And in effect, that set off a rebellion. And I would argue that or many scholars have argued that in a way was the era where you get the beginning of the modern version of the Sunni-Shi'i split. Because the next thing that happened, so I'm fast forwarding a bit. 1481 he took over. He had 2 minor campaigns that I can remember, one against Ak-Kerman in the Black Sea, and one against 2 islands in the Greek coast. So it's not big campaigns, little campaigns. So then in the 1480s, he had a war against the Mamluks, which in effect, it was a tie, but the Mamluks came off better than the Ottomans. That was from like 1485 to 1491. In the 1490s, after knocking off his brother with poison through a spy, he then invested in the navy. And that's the beginning of the powerful Ottoman navy. And the Ottoman Navy was the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean from pretty much the 1490s when they really invested in it, all the way until probably the early 18th century. And then they started losing to the other Europeans.
The Portuguese probably.
Well, not in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, it's more the Spanish Habsburgs, the papacy, France, and then later on it's Britain and Russia and the Dutch. But
Nice.
But so from the 1490s to something like the 1730s, the Ottomans were the best navy in the Mediterranean.
So he was a good ruler, it sounds, other than,
He's an administrative ruler. Yeah, he's an administrative ruler is what I would say.
Okay.
And yeah, he was a solid ruler. So there was the navy, and the first grand admiral that mattered was Kemal Rais. So Rais means captain in the Ottoman. It's the same as Rais, the president, but in the Ottoman parlance, it means captain. And so Kemal Rais was the first significant Ottoman admiral, and he's famous because in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella kicked all the Muslims and Jews out of Spain, the Ottomans, through Kemal Rais, mounted a rescue mission. And they rescued any Muslim and Jew who wanted to join the fleet. And that's when a lot of Spanish Jews ended up in the Ottoman Empire. And that's the beginning of very large Jewish communities in Salonika, Istanbul, Smyrna. Those are the big three. And they're known as Ladino Jews, who speak Ladino, which is like Yiddish in that it's basically Spanish and Hebrew, just like Yiddish is mostly German and Hebrew.
And I know you didn't want to get into this, but that's where I heard that theory that they had to do with the fall of the Ottoman Empire later on.
There is this conspiracy theory about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And the conspiracy theory is that he was in effect a dönme plant. Now, what is a dönme? A dönme is a 17th century term. So in the 17th century, there was a Jewish Messiah of sorts named, what was that guy's name? Well, anyway, a Jewish Messiah turned up in Izmir, in Smyrna. And he was all the rage amongst European Jews, extending as far as Poland and Italy and France. Like he was the Jewish Messiah, like all over Europe. And at a certain point, this Messiah figure was called into the palace, and the Sultan at that time in the 17th century said, you either convert to Islam or you're not leaving here alive. Like basically made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And he converted, and that's Sabbatai Tzvi. That's the guy, Sabbatai Tzvi, whose house has just been renovated in Smyrna, by the way.
He converted.
He converted. And part of his community converted with him, and part of his community did not. And the community that converted with him are known as the dönme. And dönme means the ones who turn, or convert, I guess is what it's implying. And the dönme maintained their community's coherence even going forward. Like to this day, they are a distinct community. They have their own mosque in downtown Istanbul, and they are a distinct community within Turkish Islam.
Interesting. So they're almost like ethnically Jewish but religiously Muslim.
You could make that argument, and to this day they have their own distinctive community identity. Now that's where the conspiracy theory comes from. One of Mustafa Kemal's teachers was from the dönme community. And the conspiracy theory is Mustafa Kemal, who is the ultimate secularist, anti-Muslim. He's not necessarily anti-Muslim, but that's how he's remembered. Like, definitely secularist. In an era of very high secularism, early 20th century, Mustafa Kemal, at the stroke of a pen, ended the Ottoman Empire and created the Turkish Republic as a secular republic. So that's where that conspiracy theory comes from. And a lot of modern Turks believe it. It's not a small conspiracy theory. It's a major conspiracy theory.
I mean, why does this conspiracy theory exist that they wanted to overrun the Muslim empire in sorts if they themselves were Muslim?
Well, that's why it's a conspiracy theory. I mean, they do have a distinctive community. They have preserved their distinctiveness. And by the way, they're very parallel in a sense with something very similar that happened in Spain of Jews who were obliged to convert to Catholicism. And a lot of them ended up in New Mexico. And and there's a name for them as well. They're also a distinctive Catholic community in New Mexico of a community that used to be Jewish, and they also maintain their communal cohesion.
This exists also. I know his name's Ahmed Weinberg. He's a comedian. An entire neighborhood community, I think, up in New York of Jews converted to Islam, and
they followed him.
No, they just converted to Islam. I'm not sure for what reason, and they all have like that kind of naming, which is like Ahmed. Even their Muhammad is slightly different,
but they're Muslim. It differently.
They're Muslim, so or were they still forced to be Muslim? Were they treated bad in Turkey at that time?
I'm not aware that they were treated badly.
Like, what's the conspiracy here? What did they
Well, the
conspire?
conspiracy is a modern one about the 1920s. It's not about the 17th century or the 18th century or the 19th century. It's a conspiracy theory about the early 20th century. And the conspiracy is, or the conspiracy theory is that the Dönme, who I guess are crypto-Jews, according to the conspiracy theory, wanted to end the Ottoman Empire, so they educated and kind of planted Ataturk to do that. That's the conspiracy theory.
And Ataturk was Mustafa Kemal's
Mustafa Kemal.
Mustafa Kemal's student.
Nickname. No, Mustafa Kemal is the name of Ataturk.
Oh, okay.
Ataturk is his title.
Okay.
So, and Ataturk in Turkish means the father of the Turks,
Yeah.
which almost was a little bit of a joke because he had no sons.
Huh.
He had no offspring, as far as I know.
I find, because in my comments section, I find some of the people most against Muslims are these Ataturk like lovers. Like, until this day, they're loyal to him. Why is that? Because Ataturk was against Islam as well, or is he a secular movement?
I think you could argue that Ataturk was anti-religion, not so much anti-Muslim, but anti-religion. In an era of a lot of people being anti-religious. So he was influenced by French laïcité, which is to say extreme secularism, and it's the French brand, which is different than the American brand. The American brand is where you separate church and state. The French brand is where the state dominates the church, and all you can have is personal religious faith, but you can't show it in public. So the French form of secularism is more extreme than the American form, and Ataturk agreed with that. He really was, in effect, a French secularist. But he was also a German materialist, influenced by social Darwinism. These are all things that are going on in the late 19th century.
And nationalism as well was also happening?
Nationalism for sure, Turkish nationalism, which introduced this era of Turkish nationalism on the one hand and Arab nationalism on the other hand, which the British encouraged because it was politically useful for them in the early 20th century. It's only in the late 20th century that you start to have what I would call reactions against the nationalisms. And you start to see some Turks starting to learn Arabic and some ethnic Arabs starting to learn Turkish. So things start to change at the end of the 20th century, but there's that most of the 20th century is very nationalist.
So back to where we were.
1490s. Okay,
Yes.
so in 1492, Kemal Rais rescued any Jews and Muslims who wanted to and evacuated them from Spain.
Were the Ottomans holding Spain at this point?
No. In effect, what I think happened is the Spanish either allowed them to go. It's like, well, as long as you're not in our hair, we don't mind. Or the Spanish Habsburgs were not able to stop it because it happened at night or something like that. I don't really know for sure.
So the Muslim hold on Spain was its own almost individual.
Well, the thing to remember is that the Reconquista, as it is called, ended in 1492. The same year that Ferdinand and Isabella unified their two crowns into one, and the same year as Christopher Columbus discovering, as I like to joke, he discovered India, because that's what he thought. He thought he discovered India. All that's 1492. It's the same year. And in that same year, they mandated that Muslims and Jews have to convert. Now, did they all convert? No. I mean, this took 30, 40 years before it really played out. But that's where the harassment started. So in response, the Ottomans rescued... Yeah, that's the Spanish Inquisition, which starts a bit later. But the Ottoman reaction was to rescue not just Muslims, but Muslims and Jews. And not just Jews, but Jews and Muslims.
Interesting.
So, all right, so into the 1490s, the next, I guess, military thing that happens is a war with Venice and France, 1498 to 1501. The Ottomans won. The Ottomans won that war. And after that, most of the time, Venice was an ally of the Ottomans. That was the last, well, it wasn't the last, but it was one of the last times that that Venice went to war against the Ottomans. And by 1506, Bayezid was starting to get sick, and they kept waiting for him to die. And in 1509, there was a huge earthquake, which almost destroyed all of Istanbul. So Bayezid left to Edirne. He's sickly, he's old, and that's when the surviving princes start to get ready for a succession struggle. And that's the next part of the story, is the succession struggle that brought Salim the Grim to power. So there were 4 surviving princes in 1511 when the succession struggle started. So there's Korkut, my guy, and Korkut in 1509 went off to the Mamluks. Like, he fled and then came back under negotiation. And he went to Kansuh al-Ghawri, the Mamluk Sultan, and he was their guest in Cairo for like a year. And then he came back with funding and weapons and all kinds of support from the Mamluks, because he was in effect the Mamluk candidate. If Korkut had won, the Mamluks would have been very happy. And so Korkut was one. Another one was Ahmed. And Ahmed was the one that Bayezid preferred. Ahmed was very similar to Bayezid. He was what you might think of as an administrative prince. He represented continuity. He was close to all the guys on the divan, which is to say the cabinet. And Ahmed, like Bayezid, had like 8 sons, a lot of sons, and a big family. And he controlled central Anatolia. Korkut controlled the Mediterranean coast. And Korkut lost a lot of support because he went to the Mamluks. He was seen by many as a traitor for going to the Mamluks. Anyway, there's that politics. The third one to mention is one named Shehenshah, and Shehenshah was in charge of Konya in southern Anatolia, and Shehenshah was the first one to get killed. And then the fourth one was Salim, who's known as Salim the Grim in English. And he was up in Trabzon, which is to say up in the Black Sea. So you got one in Trabzon, one in Amasya, one in Antalya, and one in Konya in 1511. Korkut in 1511 just one day took off and headed for the capital. Probably because there was a rumor that Bayezid had died. Probably. The moment he took off, a rebellion started, known as the Shah Kulu Rebellion. That's in 1511, and that rebellion spread all over Anatolia. And it was basically a rebellion of what were known as Kizilbash, what are today known as Alevis. Their descendants today are known as Alevis, or followers of Ali. You can think of them, if you want, as Turkish Shiites, but that's a bit simplistic. Today, they're about 15% of Turkey's population, both Kurdish and Turkish by ethnicity. In any case, there was a huge rebellion of the Shah Kulu Rebellion. It started in Antalya on the Mediterranean coast and just spread everywhere. And it was chaos. And Shehenshah allegedly joined the Kizilbash Rebellion, allegedly. So Bayezid ordered his execution. And so he was executed. So he's the first one of the 4 to be eliminated. And most historical accounts don't even pay him any attention. They only talk about the big 3. So Shehenshah is almost a footnote. But I include him because he really should be included. So Korkut went. Now this then gets really chaotic. Korkut's up in Istanbul. The blow-by-blow account is really very complex. But in a nutshell, Salim went from Trabzon to Crimea to Bulgaria to Thrace, outside of Constantinople, and he had the support of the Crimean Tatars. So that was his support. And at first, he marched on Constantinople. Bayezid pulled together his generals, and they defeated Salim, but they didn't kill Salim. They just defeated him,
And
and he retreated.
this is Bayezid, the guy that's still in control, their father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So he's sickly, he's elderly, he's old, but he's still at the head of the main army. So he defeated Salim's smaller army, and Salim withdrew back into Bulgaria and possibly all the way to Crimea. Meanwhile, Ahmed is sitting in central Anatolia, Amasya, and he's going, "What's going on? Why are they all being disloyal and I'm being loyal?" So he then marched on Constantinople, and from central Anatolia to Constantinople. But when he got to the Bosphorus, the Janissaries rebelled against him. They didn't want him. They wanted Salim. So he was powerless. He had to withdraw. It's think of it as like a three-way military coup, and he didn't have the support, so he withdrew. And then Korkut showed up with in Constantinople. He was the first one to get to Constantinople, and he had a ship full of gold. So he was going to buy everybody off, but the Janissaries had a big meeting in the barracks. And some of them wanted to take the money and announce that Korkut was the new ruler, and some of them didn't. So a big brouhaha. And at the end of the meeting, they decided to go with Salim. And
Off of what basis?
Salim had spies and supporters amongst the Janissaries. And he was the military candidate in that he was very aggressive. He had attacked the new power of the Safavids in the east, and he had attacked the Georgians. So in effect, Salim was the aggressive, military, combative young prince. He was the youngest of the four.
Well, Ahmed, why didn't he know that his dad wanted him to rule next? Why would he even run a coup?
Well, because Korkut had already gotten to Istanbul, and Salim had already attacked from the other side of Istanbul, from the western side. So Ahmed just threw up his hands in the air and marched on Constantinople himself, but couldn't get there because the Janissaries said no way.
None of them decided to talk to their dad?
Well, they're all talking to their dad. And his dad's like saying, get back to where you belong. His dad's like, get back to your post. Your post is on Talia, Trabzon, and Namaz. Get back to where you belong.
Oh.
But they're all trying to take power. So at the end of several months, this is not a 1 week thing or a 2 day thing. This is several months of a lot of developments, which hasn't been explained in English very well, to be honest. Like the best scholarship on this is in Turkish, like the blow-by-blow account. The reconstruction, if you will, of the blow-by-blow account was done in Turkish. Nobody's really done it that well in English, I think. One fella's tried, though. In any case, Salim won. How did Salim win? After the Janissaries decided they didn't want to go with Korkut because Salim had supporters in the Janissary crowd, Salim then marched on the city again, but this time it was a negotiated acceptance of his rule. And what he was called was not the new ruler, but the regent. And basically Bayezid was obliged to retire. So yeah, there's a second retirement. And Bayezid was scared, according to most accounts, like he was shaking. And because Salim was so aggressive. Bayezid was then going to go into retirement in what is today northern Greece, like about 2 hours away from Istanbul. And on the way there, he died. And most people think that Salim had him poisoned.
How old was he?
Bayezid, I don't know exactly how old, but he was probably...
Was he an old man?
He was probably in his late 60s or early 70s would be my guess. So he's oldish. And by the way, you didn't live as long then as you do now. So he's probably in his early 70s, which in today's world would put him in his mid-80s.
He was...
64? That's all he was? Oh, my. That's not that old. That's not that old.
Yeah, because I was like, I would have let my dad live if he's in, but...
Yeah, well, he wasn't in good health, even if he was just 64. So Salim probably poisoned him on his way to retirement. And then Salim took over, and at first he negotiated with Korkut saying, look, we're okay. And Ahmed made a proposal, let's split the empire. And Salim's like, no, we're not splitting the empire. So what Salim did after a few more months, like he didn't do this right away, after a few more months, he did a surprise march on Korkut, who by then was in Manisa, which is on the Aegean, and or near the Aegean, and Korkut had to flee. And he flee on a horse to a cave near Antalya, and he would have gotten away. He was trying to get a ship to the Mamluks or to the Knights of Rhodes, but his horse was so good that the peasants turned him in. It's almost like a guy today trying to run away from the police, but he's in a Lamborghini. And everybody's like, wait a minute, I know that guy. So the peasants turned him in, or some informant turned him in.
Wow.
So he was brought back up north where he was strangled on the way. So that left only Ahmed. Ahmed was in central Anatolia with all of his sons, which means he had a lot of power in central Anatolia. Salim then marched on him. There was a battle. Ahmed didn't really have a chance, and then he was also executed. And so Salim took over.
I can already tell by the nickname he has, The Grim.
The Grim.
Where this might be going. What was his story?
He was also a pretty good poet, and most of his poetry was in Persian, not Turkish. And Salim was very, very aggressive and militant, and he was a military type, whereas Korkut was never very much at military. He would send guys to battle. He wouldn't go to battle himself. So, for example, in that Venice French War in 1499 to 1502, Korkut supposedly fought in that war. There's a whole book that sings the glory of Korkut, which he paid for. He patronized it. But Korkut didn't do anything. He just sent guys to fight. He didn't go himself. So, he's not really a military figure. Now, back to Salim. There's a great part of Salim's story. In Turkish, he's known as Yavuz Salim. And Yavuz in modern Turkish is both a name and a title. The title means the bold. The bold. And Yavuz is a name that you run across in modern Turkey quite a bit. I mean, if you meet enough Turks, you'll meet a Yavuz eventually. But in the 16th century, based on poetry, it seems that Yavuz actually meant wicked, as in like evil.
Wow.
So what seems to have happened is that his nickname was Evil Salim. And in the European sources, he's remembered as Salim the Grim. In the Ottoman sources, he's known as Yavuz Salim. And what I think happened is over a century of court literature changed the meaning of Yavuz. Like it started out meaning evil or wicked, but 100 years later, instead it meant bold. so they couldn't get rid of the nickname. They just changed the meaning of the nickname over 100 years of cultural policy, if you want.
And why did they call him evil and grim?
Well, the first thing he did was knock off his brothers. Well, okay, you had to do that. But the second thing he did in 1513 is potentially genocidal. He went after the Kizilbash. And the way the histories read, he took the names of 40,000 Kizilbash and killed them all. Like put their names in a defter, in a notebook, and killed them all. Now that defter has never been found, and 40,000 is kind of a magic number. As you're probably aware, there are certain magic numbers: 1, 3, 7, 12, 70, 40, and 72. Those are your magic numbers. In all societies, they're not just in Muslim societies. Those are always the magic numbers. So it's probably a literary trope that he wrote down 40,000 names and had them all killed. But it is indicative of a lot of violence. And he went after the Kizilbash, who you could call Turkish Shiites, but that's too simplistic.
Where were they located?
They were all over Anatolia.
Okay.
And if they weren't, and Bayezid didn't so much kill them. Because Bayezid had a couple of smaller rebellions. Bayezid moved them to modern Greece, and so they were then a fish out of water. So they're Muslim Turkish nomadic figures who had rebelled against the empire. He moved them from Antalya to Greece and others to Cyprus, and at that point they become a fish out of water, and they no longer rebelled. But what Salim did was he killed 40,000 of them, or at least that's what the narratives say. And then he immediately went after Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid Empire in Iran, and the reason that Iran is Shi'i. So if you're not aware of this, Iran in 1500 was 90% what we would call Sunni. Mind you, it's a little bit different than the modern Sunni and Shi'i. But they were 90% Sunni and 10% Shi'i. 100 years later, it had flipped. It was 90% Shi'i and 10% Sunni, which is what Iran is today. And that's because of the Safavids. The Safavids changed Iran from a mostly Sunni society to a mostly Shi'i society, and they kind of changed the definition of Shi'ism along the way. So a year after he wiped out 40,000 Kizilbash, who were accused of being sympathizers with the Safavids, which is, it's too simplistic, but it's largely accurate, that they were sort of seen as a fifth column. Now, there's all kinds of debates on this.
Proxy. An Iranian proxy.
An Iranian proxy in Turkey, in Anatolia. Now, there's all kinds of historical debates about this, and I don't want to simplify it, oversimplify it, but that's the simple way to think of it. Is they were accused of being Safavid sympathizers, so Salim went after them. Then he exchanges correspondence with Shah Ismail, and it's the same thing again, like with Beyezid and Timur. Yo mama, no yo mama, no yo mama. So it's in the literature what they said to each other. Whether it's accurate or not, I'm not 100% sure, because it's mostly in Munshaat literature, and Munshaat is where you learn how to write letters. So anyway, in 1514 at the Battle of Chaldiran, there was a big battle, and the Ottomans defeated the Safavids. They didn't wipe them out, and the Safavids just withdrew, and the Ottomans then advanced all the way to Tabriz. And they took Tabriz, but after about 2 weeks, the Janessaries told Salim, you've got to withdraw. They forced him to withdraw. The Janessaries forced Salim to withdraw. And that's a bit of a mystery. Why? Why didn't they just spend the winter in Tabriz and keep going? And to my knowledge, nobody has conclusively demonstrated why they in effect rebelled. Like, they told Salim, not only aren't we going any further, we're going home. So Salim was forced by his own soldiers to withdraw. So the next thing that happened in 1515 is Salim wiped out the last Beylik, I think. I think it was the last Beylik, the Dhul Qadrids, like Dhul Qadr. And the Dhul Qadrids were based out of like southern Anatolia, wiped them out in 1515, which brings us to 1516, and that's the Battle of Marj Dabik. The Battle of Marj Dabik is where they blew away Kansuh al-Ghawri, the last powerful Mamluk sultan, in what is today northern Syria. Now, I've been to that village, Marj Dabik. It's about 10 miles from the Turkish border in Syria. And there's not much there. It's not a very large village. There's only a couple of thousand people today there. And I was there during the Syrian civil war as a relief worker. We were just driving through, and I'm like, this is Marj Dabik? Are you crazy? This place is famous. The driver's like, yeah, it's Marj Dabik. So what? Let's keep going. So I'm looking around. There's no monument. There's no commemoration whatsoever of this hugely important battle, which actually makes sense, because who does the Arab world see as their heroes? Not the Ottomans, the Mamluks. So this is seen in most modern Arab historiography as a defeat for the Arabs, which isn't really accurate because the Mamluks weren't Arab. They were themselves Circassian, Turkish, etc. But it's often seen in Arab education as being a defeat for the Arabs. So that's why there's no monument there.
That brings me to wonder, what was the rest of the Arab world, or not Arab, the Muslim world looking like that spanned all the way from India, China to Spain, Morocco, looking like as the Ottomans were? Were the Ottomans in control of the entire Muslim world? Was it centralized, or?
If you're talking about 1500, in the year 1500, you have the Mamluks who control Egypt and Syria and the Hejaz. You have the Ottomans who control most of Anatolia and the Balkans. And you have the Safavids who are taking control over Iran, Caucasus, Iraq, and Eastern Anatolia. And then beyond that, you have the Uzbeks, and Shaibani Khan is their ruler, who in 1510 lost a battle to Shah Ismail. So Shah Ismail turned his head into a silver cup and sent that as a gift to the Ottomans in 1510.
Wild. Turned his head into a cup?
Yeah, like decapitated him and put the head into silver and then gave that as a gift to the Ottoman court.
This was a Muslim ruler.
Yes, a Muslim ruler.
Okay.
Yeah, Shaibani Khan.
Wow.
So who lost a battle in 1510 to Shah Ismail. So you have the Uzbeks who controlled much of Central Asia. So let's go down the list. We have Mamluks, Ottomans, Safavids, Uzbeks, and then you have the Timurids. And the Timurids were in, at that time, what is today mostly Afghanistan, and they were pushed out of Afghanistan by the Uzbeks. So they fled south and established what became known as the Mughal dynasty in India.
In India, yeah.
India and Pakistan and so on. So those are your 5 major Muslim powers in the year 1500.
And did this lead to the age of Suleiman?
Suleiman is the son of Salim. So Salim died in 1520. So to finish his reign, in 1516 was Marj Dabik. In 1517 it was in Egypt, the Battle of Raydaniya, which I think was near the pyramids, but I'm not 100% sure where Raydaniya was. And then in 1518, he's cleaning up the Mamluks, like going all the way to like the Sudanese border to mop up any Mamluk opposition. And then in 1518, he returned to Constantinople, and he died in 1520.
Of natural causes?
Yeah, it seems of natural causes. And he had one surviving son, so there was no succession struggle, and that one surviving son was Suleiman.
And this is Suleiman the Magnificent?
It's Suleiman the Magnificent.
The one with
known in the Islamic world not as the Magnificent, but as Kanuni. Kanuni Suleiman. And there's gossip about why there was only one son, because it seems that Salim had 4 sons, and the gossip, according to the Italians, is that Salim poisoned 3 out of 4 of his sons, like killed his own sons, so that the surviving son would not have to deal with a civil war. But that's an Italian diplomatic letter, and it might or might not be true. It's a conspiracy theory. It's a 1520 conspiracy theory, which some scholars point to and say, well, he might have done it, and it's true, he might have done it, but I don't know.
Of a man named The Grim. You know?
The Grim, yeah. There's nothing positive about Salim in most sources. Well, no, that's not accurate. He was so controversial that there then arose an entire genre of literature to glorify Salim that came mostly from palace patronage. It started during his own rule, but then continued well into Suleiman's rule. And this genre is called Salim Names, or treatises on Salim. And it's modeled on the Shahnameh. I don't know if you're familiar with the Shahnameh, but it's by Firdausi. It is the great Iranian epic about ancient Iran, written in the 11th century. So that set the template for royal mythological propaganda, if you will. And the Shahnameh is super famous, of Firdausi. who died in 1021. And the Salim Names, there's like 30 of them. They don't call them, the title is never Salim Name. It's always some rhyming title, the great exploits of Salim, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in a rhyme. And there's like 30 of them.
Was he good to his own people, though?
Well, I'm not even sure he was good to his own people, because the Janessaries rebelled against him after he marched them from Constantinople to Tabriz, which is about 1,000 miles.
Jeez.
Like, he pushed them hard. And they had cannon, they had horse. I mean, they had the whole 9 yards. So I'm not sure he was good to his own people.
Well, how about the empire? Was the empire healthy under his rule?
I think the empire was under absolute bloodbath chaos under his rule. But it expanded. And under Suleiman is usually considered a very good ruler. So it's almost like you get the conqueror, you get the Beyezid, you get another conqueror, and then you get Suleiman.
Okay.
Now, Suleiman also conquered a fair share, but he was both a conqueror and an administrator, if you want to put it that way.
And what happened under Suleiman?
That's a whole, I think that might be a whole nother episode.
I think we talked about him last time and how he had like a giant crown, something like that.
He had a massive crown, which was worth 100,000 ducats in Italian currency, which means it was like the most expensive crown ever made. And it's disappeared. Nobody knows where it is.
Yeah, that's very strange.
So it might show up at a garage sale someday.
Yeah.
You know?
You can make a whole movie out of these tales.
Oh, there's wonderful stuff for Hollywood there if they'd ever look into it.
Look into Muslim.
Yeah.
Well, how about the decline theory? We can go into how the Ottoman Empire eventually fell and why.
Well, there's the whole debate about what is called the decline theory of the Ottomans. And the original decline theory was very simplistic. The original decline theory simply said Suleiman was the last talented ruler, and after him they were all idiots. And there's 30 more Ottoman sultans. I mean, there's 40-something Ottoman sultans total, and Suleiman is just number 10. And no, they were not all idiots. And no, the empire did not start declining after Suleiman died. There's almost no way to measure it where you would make that argument. So in terms of land that they ruled over, they continued to expand, and they hit their largest land area at around 1620. And Suleiman died in 1566. So they had another 55 years of growth if you're measuring it by land. If you're measuring it by military power, they continued to be the most powerful empire in anywhere until easily the middle of the 18th century.
So 1750s.
Yeah, 1750s. That's when, well, yeah, no, that's not quite right. They're the most powerful empire until after the defeat of Vienna in 1683. That's when they start to win some, lose some. But up until 1683, they're not quite undefeated, but they're winning a lot more than they're losing in all these wars. It's only after Vienna that they start losing more than they're winning. And it's really a draw through, I would say, the 1770s. And in the 1770s, they lose their first war to the Russians. And after that, and by the way, the 1770s isn't even that long ago.
No.
So they
America was
only starting out, right?
Yeah.
So here's what I would say is they're if you're going to measure it militarily, they're almost always winning until 1683, and then they're kind of sometimes winning, sometimes losing until the 1770s. And then they're losing more than they're winning from the 1770s until 1923 when they ended. But they had some, even in that period where they're mostly losing, they still win some. For example, the Battle of Gallipoli, they won the Battle of Gallipoli in World War I. They defeated the British Army in Mesopotamia in World War I at the Battle of Kut.
They were never colonized by any European state, right?
No, they never colonized, but they were under European domination briefly after World War I.
Okay.
And they had European bankers and European bureaucrats kind of breathing down their neck in the late 19th century as well.
Why did they allow, or maybe even they weren't able to stop it, the colonization of the Arabian world? And when did that even happen, the colonization of the Arabian world?
Well, that's more of a 19th century problem.
19th century.
And well, the earliest one that I think the Ottomans lost control over is Algeria, and that would have been the 1830s when France invaded Algeria. They lost Tunisia in the 1880s. They lost what became Libya to the Italians right before World War I. And Egypt. All right, so Egypt, you could say Egypt's before the 1830s, but there's a fascinating thing about Egyptian historiography where they treat Muhammad Ali, or as the Ottomans would call him, Mehmed Ali, as the founder of modern Egypt half the time. Well, Muhammad Ali was an Albanian, and he was a loyal Ottoman or a loyal Ottoman general. He was sent down to Egypt in 1805 from what is today Greece to recover Egypt from the French who had pulled out, and that's the beginning of the Khedives or the Khadawis and the Khedives, who made it all the way to 1952 when Nasser overthrew King Farouk. But Muhammad Ali himself, or Mehmed Ali, which is really more proper, Mehmed Ali himself was a loyal Albanian Ottoman general, and he was arguably loyal all the way to his death in what I think was about 1848 or something. So as a loyal Ottoman general, Muhammad Ali helped the Ottomans put down the Greek rebellion in the 1820s. And that was because Constantinople asked him to send an army. He did. And by the way, he was from there. I mean, he was from near there. By the way, there is a theory that Muhammad Ali might have actually been Kurdish, like an ethnic Kurd who was born and raised in what is today northern Greece, but was Albanian territory. So it's more complicated than I've even said. But anyway, depending on your interpretation, he's not really the founder of modern Egypt at all. He's a loyal Ottoman. And one thing to remember about the Khedive family is that they still spoke Turkish well into the 20th century. Like even the ones in the 1940s were speaking Turkish. So they were in effect ethnic Turks, in effect.
So what I'm interested in getting from your perspective is, why did the Muslim world, or how did the Muslim world kind of fall and crumble into what it is today? Because I think I said this to you on the phone the other day. In the last 300 years or so, give or take, it has been our medieval times in a way.
Yeah, there is that sort of argument. Well, I guess what I would say is maybe the following is the last powerful Muslim empire were the Ottomans, because the Mughals were taken over by the British in 1857. That's the end of the Mughals, after what they call the Sepoy Mutiny. And the Safavids were done by the 1720s, and what replaced them eventually were the Qajars, and the Qajars were an absolute basket case by the end of the 19th century. So they were not important. Iran was chaos at the early 20th century. So in effect, the Ottomans were the last ones. Now, another thing to point out is we often think of the Islamic world as falling behind Europe far earlier than they actually fell behind Europe. In other words, oftentimes the historians will say they were already losing by the 16th century. That's not really accurate. It's only in the 19th century that the Muslim world really starts to be colonized by Europe. And when you look back on it today, in 2024, the Europeans only controlled the Muslim world as colonizers and imperialists for not even a century, I would say. Basically, from maybe the 1870s to World War II. I mean, it's not quite a century. Now, is the Muslim world powerful today? Well, I mean, if you want it to be, maybe not as much as it could be, but even today, you have individual Muslims that are doing extremely well. And I don't mean in terms of wealth. I mean in terms of things like science and literature and poetry, etc. So I don't think the picture is as bad as most people think.
Just here in America, the narrative I hear from a lot of Western ideologues is that the Muslims are now backwards, that the Europeans have overran them, like you're saying, that it happened much earlier in the 16th century, and Muslims have really almost internalized that.
Right, but I don't think it's accurate. I think it would be accurate to say that there was serious weakness, that you could see problems in the 18th century, but it's only by the 1870s that the Ottomans really, really get weak. It's 1878, there's the Treaty of Berlin, and they lost most of the Balkans. And in the Balkan War of 1912-1913, they lost the rest of the Balkans, which leads us into World War I. That's what caused World War I, the Balkan War. And the Ottomans lost World War I, but they put up a pretty good fight. And emerging out of World War I is a disaster for the Arab world. But not as much of a disaster for modern Turkey. Like, arguably, they're pretty strong today, and they've been getting stronger throughout the last 100 years, arguably.
Yeah, they have. So where do you see the Muslim world going in the next 10 years, 15, 20 years? However much you can see into it. Or can you even predict that?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm thinking a lot of it may have to do with climate change and how that plays out, especially after Dubai got flooded. I mean, what is that about?
Cloud seeding, maybe?
Yeah, but it makes no sense to me at all.
Maybe God was upset with them with what they did with the Iran-Israel.
I read once an article which might be completely ridiculous, but somebody was suggesting that the Gulf Stream's going to shift, which I think is accurate for Europe, and it's going to have all these unexpected effects, like rain in the Sahara, and maybe we just saw the first example of that. Yeah, which then makes you say, well, maybe we should just pump to make the Middle East turn green. But that's ridiculous.
I mean, the prophecy.
Is there a prophecy on
towards
this?
the end of times that the Arabian Peninsula would turn green again, right?
Oh, dear. Well, I'm not necessarily looking forward to the end of times myself.
I'm not sure how well-versed you are in Islamic prophecies, but a lot of them
clearly
have happened.
Not well enough versed.
Oh, a lot of them have happened. Like, it's kind of mind-blowing how many.
Yeah, well, all right. So I should look into this more.
Yeah, like one of them is the barefooted Arabs, the camel-herded Arabs will start competing in skyscraper building, like in tall buildings.
Yeah, that's Dubai.
That's Dubai, and right now Saudi Arabia too. They're the ones competing.
Well, and have you seen drawings of Neom? Have you heard of Neom?
Is that the Line City?
Yes, the Line City,
yeah.
The one that's supposed to be 50 kilometers long, and it's all in glass. That's never going to happen.
Yeah,
no. And they've already lost their investors, and they're shrinking the plans. But the whole idea is ridiculous to begin with. Yeah,
there's a reason why.
But you know what's hilarious about Neom is when I was flying into Egypt a year and a half ago on this trip, we were on Turkish Airlines, and as we were. You know how on planes they'll have like the map of where you are? Neom was on the map. And there's nothing there yet.
That's when you know they're going to not do it.
Right. There's nothing on there's no Neom. There's nothing there but a village today and maybe a couple of dump trucks. And Turkish Airlines shows it as a proper city.
I always say that, a business is going to fail or a startup is going to fail when they start making merchandise before the actual product.
Yes, arguably, this is a good analogy.
Yeah, interesting. Because I love that you have a very cosmopolitan, almost non-biased view, but an expertise view of the Muslim world as well. And I think a lot of the times us Muslims are fed biased narratives either from the West or the Muslim world, where it's either over-grandized or over criticized. So I am curious as to where you see the Muslim. This will end with this: where you see the Muslim world today, and do you think that this zeal that you said it will be arising in these next generations, as we're seeing the Palestinian protests go on for more than 6 months and so on?
Well, on that particular conflict, I'm somewhat optimistic, but not because of military means, more because people are protesting against violence in a way that I agree with, and so I don't think the future is necessarily Hamas or ISIS or any of those movements. To me, it's more like the students who are protesting at Columbia today. And its advocacy and its activism and I don't necessarily see it through an Islamic lens either. I mean, I by heritage I'm half Muslim and it's on the father's half, but and I'm sympathetic enough, but I'm not necessarily seeing it through an Islamic lens. But if I'm looking at it objectively as the Islamic world, there's some things to be pretty optimistic about. So, for example, I think the Turkish state is likely to muddle through, and in muddling through, it will probably remain a regional power. And I'm not a fan of Erdogan politically at all. I'm not sure I should be saying that on the internet, but even though I'm not a fan of Erdogan, I would have to agree that Turkey in 2024 is more powerful than Turkey was in the year 2000. It has grown as a power, and it has grown as an economy. And a lot of that I hate, because that meant that they did a lot of the same things that they've done in Egypt, which is to say, pour a lot of concrete. I'm really against pouring a lot of concrete, and both countries have poured a lot of concrete. But on the other hand, the average income of Turkish society has gone way up. It's gone from being mostly poor to being mostly middle class. And you cannot say that of for example, Egypt. You certainly can't say it about Syria. Syria was better off 20 years ago than it is today. You can't say it about Lebanon. Lebanon's a basket case. Iraq may have turned a corner. Iraq is better off now than it was 10 years ago. Iran may have turned a corner. Iran's doing better than it used to be, I think.
It's almost like the sanctions helped it become more self-sustaining. It's interesting.
Because they turned to China, and China's like, yeah, we're with you, quietly. So, I think there's a funny thing about sanctions. When you over-sanction, you encourage people to just get what they need elsewhere.
Yeah.
And you also undermine regular commerce. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that the U.S. government has over-sanctioned much of the world. So much of the world is just like saying, okay, or not just saying, but actually behaving independently of what Washington wants. If Washington wants to control things, you have to do it through persuasion and collective action. You don't do it by sanctioning everybody in a huff of anger.
You know Professor John Mearsheimer by any chance?
Yeah, Mearsheimer, yeah.
Mearsheimer?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he says that America's been operating in an ideological way, and much of the world today operates in realism. Even Russia's and Iran's and China's cooperation has been much more of a realistic one than one of an ideological one.
Well, the cooperation between those three states is clearly not ideological.
No.
Because it's completely transactional. There's no commonality between China, Russia, and Iran that is long-term. It's completely transactional. As for Washington being ideological, I think I might agree with that largely. And I'm especially seeing it now where it's become somewhat divorced from reality, and you're seeing reality through global public opinion.
Yeah. Professor Nabil Al-Tikriti, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I only hope if any of my Ottoman history colleagues see this, that I didn't make too many detailed mistakes.
And I hope we can have you back on, honestly, because I'm looking here and we still got the long 17th century millet system, auspicious occasion, Abdul Ahmad II, Caliphate, World War I.
Plenty
we
more.
touched upon it, but it was a pleasure having you on. Hope for many more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for joining the Ansari podcast.